Hello and welcome to the Week 3 Supplemental Lecture on Domenico Losurdo's What is Liberalism? This is a longish piece, but it's relatively easy to read, and the theoretical content is fairly quick to summarize, so this will be a shorter supplemental lecture than many. But Losurdo is concerned with a question somewhat similar to the one that Connell asks in Week 1, which is why certain figures make it into our canon of classical liberal theories, and some don't, and why certain aspects of the thought of thinkers in the canon make it in, are part of our conception of what classical liberalism is, and why certain aspects are relatively suppressed. And he's interested particularly in the relationship of various figures to institutions like slavery and colonialism, and how that affects the distinctions they make in their own time, and the people, the category of the human to which they apply the categories of liberalism, and the humans that they exclude from that category. So those are his concerns. So he starts off with a section that he calls a series of embarrassing questions, and although it's only the title of a section, essentially it's the theme of the whole book. It's what he does all the way through. He says the liberal tradition presents itself today as something that is quintessentially concerned with the liberty of the individual. It's critical of what he calls organicist philosophies that are perceived to suppress this liberty. So organicist philosophies that focus on the social whole or the nation as an organic body of which individuals are organs. And so individuality is not emphasized. And he says these sound like very powerful ideals, this focus on the liberty of the individual. But there are central figures in and outside the classical liberal canon who, on the one hand, advocate for liberal conceptions of government, for limiting the power of government, for protecting the individual and shielding them, but don't see that as inconsistent in their own time with defending institutions like slavery, the oppressive treatment of the poor within the industrial core. You have a discourse around vagrancy and deviance and degeneracy, which has come up in some of our readings last week, and colonialism. Okay? And then he notes certain historical ironies. He says that there is a notion within classical liberalism that, yes, people are aware that the early classical texts may have restricted the boundaries to which the concept of liberalism applied. So the liberty of the individual is generally known to have been something that focused on wealthy white males to begin with, but it gradually expands and expands and expands, and there's a tendency to interpret the tradition as though liberalism itself is the expansive force that corrosively sort of undermines old distinctions. But he says that actually many of these distinctions are undermined in practice by things that fall outside the conception of liberalism itself. And so in this particular section, he draws attention to the fact that the institution of slavery in the US, for example, is abolished in a manner that many people in the US and outside of it at the time viewed as despotic. Okay, and so he's thinking about the Civil War and about Lincoln sort of fiating that the institution is going to go away. So you've got a tradition that views itself as grounded in the liberty of the individual, and yet for large parts of history excludes many, many individuals, including the majority of the population for some of its history, and that views itself as intrinsically expansive, and yet at key historical points there's actually something extrinsic that gets it to expand. It might be a social movement or a governmental act. And he wants to ask what this means for our current-day relationship with liberalism, what we will appropriate, what we won't, what we might be critical of. Okay. He talks about tensions within the US revolutionary movement in this chapter. That's a lot of what it's concerned with, which asserts the rights of a segment of the population while denying them to slaves and indigenous populations. He talks about the relationship of the British Empire to the slave trade, even when there was a formal abolition of slavery within the empire, how it continued to relate to the existence of slavery in the colonies. And a general acceptance in classical liberal theory for really an extended period of time that the principles of liberty simply don't apply to indigenous populations, because indigenous populations are treated with analogy to children. They're regarded as still needing parental tending. They're not ready for the maturity, if you think of it in Kant's context. They're categorized like women, like a number of other populations, as among the sections that need to be managed. by people who have attained their maturity. Where he's going with this, he's not just trying to sully the tradition, he's not just trying to debunk it by saying that there are unsavory things in its history. He's trying to wrestle with the question of what in the tradition and what in the self-representation of the tradition we can accept as valid, and how we can extend the parts of it that are expansive, that are protective of individual liberty, how we can do something with those beyond the historical limitations of the tradition itself. So he wants to ask the question, can the habitual representation of the liberal tradition, characterized by love of liberty as such, be regarded as valid? Historically, he says, not really. Historically, there were very strong limits within the movement. Okay? And then he talks about the fact that you get interesting critiques using the ideals of liberalism, okay, that are flung at each other, for example, by the American colonists and the British government, that draw attention to hypocrisy in the use of liberalism. So there's something about the ideals that make it possible to grab hold of them and to ask the question constantly, why are you excluding this group? Why are you excluding this group? And that provides some corrosive potential, but it's not the way that corrosive potential is often thought about within the tradition itself. Okay? He also notes that liberalism itself is quiet on the question of what the form of government should be. There's not a clear connection. We talk a lot today about liberal democracy, but many of the classical liberal theorists are actually agnostic about this. This comes out in the Berlin this week as well. They want to limit the scope of authority, but are not necessarily talking much about the form of that authority. So the connection, and again, Berlin will make this point as well from a different direction this week, the connection between liberalism and democracy is not as strong as we might think today, where the two words are often used together as though they're a single thing. And he'll talk about the classical liberal theorists often talking in more sympathetic terms than we might expect them to of various forms of monarchy. So while there's a big discourse about consent of the governed, it's not necessarily consent in the sense that we think, where you've got regular voting and where you're getting rid of forms of government. Sometimes it is, but not always. Okay. Where he differs from someone like Berlin is Berlin notes the same tension, the same fact that liberalism and democracy are not always united institutions, they're not always being advocated for by the same people. Berlin is more worried about traditions that focus on self-determination and draw out those elements, because he actually thinks they tend toward organicist philosophies. They tend toward the things that become nationalism and fascism in the 20th century. This isn't Losurdo's perspective. Okay, so he thinks that the hostility of liberalism to democracy, the fact that it is somewhat agnostic as a tradition or even actively hostile with some figures to democracy, is one of the things that opens the path to nationalism, fascism, these forms of government in the 20th century. Okay, so differing interpretations of what bits of the tradition are problematic. The thing Losurdo is going to like from liberalism, and it's not so clear from this chapter, but it's something that emerges over the course of the book as a whole, is that it does have an amazing and astonishing flexibility within it. It starts quite rigidly. It starts with figures defending institutions that are deeply, deeply problematic. But it does have a capacity to learn from outside pressures, from outside social movements, and it offers tools that are regularly picked up and used by disadvantaged groups, also by the advantaged criticizing other groups of advantaged. So that you do have this progressive expansion, rolling back of barriers, and you do get a forward movement, not always linear, that is expanding individual liberty. Okay? Losurdo doesn't regard this as internal to the tradition exactly. It's something he thinks often needs to be driven by outside contestation. But he poses the question that it may be quite important to have a tradition that is amenable to being expanded and contested and extended in this way.